One of the things to keep in mind is that the way that the story of Jesus develops is, first of all, from those who were the eyewitnesses. They were the ones who walked with Jesus around Galilee. They were the ones who witnessed the healings that he performed. They were the ones who were moved by his preaching and his teaching, but I think were moved by his personhood to change their lives, if you will, and to be his followers. Those eyewitnesses then begin to tell others about Jesus. And pretty soon, at least around Galilee, the word spreads and people become the followers of Jesus and begin to form communities of believers, if you will. What happens is that by the late first century, 20 to 30 years is all that it takes. 20 to 30 years after Jesus, that a lot of stories are circulating that are just outrageous, that they're not true, first of all, and that they misread Jesus or misunderstand the teachings of Jesus. So soon those communities that were formed by eyewitnesses, now with the second generation of believers who got it from the eyewitnesses, who now are telling others that by the time it gets to the second and third generation, it's maybe far from the original story. That's how it just works, right? Sort of like the circle, right? If I were to tell a story to Pat and Pat to tell the story, by the time it got back to me, I wouldn't recognize it. So that's the danger. So communities begin to take those eyewitness accounts and pull them together into a comprehensive narrative or a comprehensive story that has a beginning, an end, and perhaps a middle in the story. So that now that written word becomes the evaluator, if you will, of these other stories. You know, if it's not there in the written word, then, well, maybe it did happen, maybe it didn't, but that's not the truth anymore. So that as that time goes on, and that would be as far as we know, the Gospel of Mark being the first of the Gospels to be written, that in the next generation, the evidence or more of these stories, firsthand stories, get collected, and now the comparison to Mark's Gospel, well, I'm making this too long and complicated this story. It sounded better in my head than what I'm saying. But the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew come along. They've got another narrative they're using as well as the narrative of Mark. And so they're able now, because the community is no longer just located in Galilee, it's now located beyond Galilee, perhaps into Syria or modern day Lebanon, or as we know, in the communities that Paul founds along the coast of Turkey and in Greece, and maybe all the way to Rome itself. That there are now different locations and different circumstances in which you're going to tell the story. So that it's no longer just as Jesus might have heard it or spoke it or did it or whatever. It's how we're going to move those events, those teachings, those experiences into the present moment, such that the present moment now shapes and colors those original stories. That's just how it works. That's a long explanation for English literature and so forth anyway. So if we were to consider the Gospel of Mark, that there comes a point in the narrative that Mark tells that it reaches the midpoint, and this is true in Mark, that if you were to count the number of verses before this midpoint and the number of verses after this midpoint, it would be exactly the center, same number of verses before, same number of verses after, suggesting that to Mark, that this experience and encounter with Jesus is critical to the whole way that we're going to read, understand, interpret not just the gospel anymore, but how we're going to live our lives. And in Mark's gospel, that center point is when on the way, meaning on kind of the journey, Jesus turns and asks the question, who do people say I am? So for Mark's community, 20 to 30 years after the time of Jesus, it's becoming important that people understand who it is that they're following and what his teaching and preaching was about, so they don't lose that connection to him and go off following some other interpretation or some other belief. So for Mark's community, responding to that question will determine how they're going to live as disciples and followers of Jesus. The responses will, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're one of the prophets. And he says again, who do you say? In other words, I'm really not interested in what other people are saying about me. I want to know what you, meaning what you, the follower, what you, the member of this discipleship community, what you believe, what you know to be true. And Peter gives the famous answer, you are the Christos, the anointed one, the Mashiach, the Messiah, the one who we've been expecting. And then in Mark's gospel, it follows the first passion prediction. Well, if this is what you believe, now you have to understand how this story has developed, that I end up in Jerusalem suffering and dying and being raised. So that if you're going to say you believe this way, you have to accept the end of the story as well as the beginning of the story, because you can't stop at this point and think that that's all that's expected or required of you as a believer. That's Mark's gospel. In Luke's gospel, it's not that we've reached the midpoint, because this story that we have today is not the midpoint of the gospel itself. But rather, it's important to understand that the body attitude that Jesus takes at this moment. Everything that has happened, as both Mark and Luke tell the story, is that Jesus comes into Galilee, and what we see before we hear is him touching lepers, associating with the poor, that he's engaged in acts of compassion towards those who often have been the victims of the society and victims of both the political and economic structures and institutions of ancient Palestine. Remember, he told the parable of the sower, that the sower had to be concerned about how much seed gets planted, because if he didn't get the right amount of seed, he won't get fed and others won't get fed. So the action or the activity of the reign of God is seen in the way that Jesus treats people with compassion, the way he lifts up people so that their dignity is first and foremost, so that we see him doing all kinds of things that relate to how we are going to, the reader and the community, are going to understand what the reign of God is about. So that when it comes to that midpoint, it's no longer about, well, you've got all this experience, you now have seen what you, the follower, have to do. Now we're going to go to Jerusalem, and you can't leave behind what you've become when we go to Jerusalem. So that in Luke's gospel, the text seems to suggest that how it's described in English is not exactly how the Greek has it. That it's almost like, we could interpret it. Oh, he's walking along and, oh, gee, this is Sunday. Why don't we go to Jerusalem today? Well, that's not it at all. It's not a casual decision like, well, let's go on vacation to Jerusalem. Wouldn't that be a fun place to go to this time of the year? It's not like that at all. Rather, the Greek suggests it stronger than the English translation, is that he sets his face firmly, squarely towards Jerusalem, so that there's a resoluteness in him, in his personhood, but a resoluteness now in the message, We've done our thing here in Galilee, and now we have to be firmly convinced, resolute in the decision to take what we've experienced and seen and done right down to the halls of power down there in Jerusalem. Right down where the religious leaders are, right down where the political leaders, Pontius Pilate and his whole crew of Romans, right down where the business people are located, because it's all happening in Jerusalem. And so it's nice that we stay here in Galilee to do with these things, but if we don't take this message to Jerusalem and address the powers that have created the injustices that we see here in Galilee, then what's the point of this message if it's not going to ultimately reshape the world in which we're living? How do you stop injustice in Galilee? You make sure that the people in Jerusalem understand that their policies and actions and decisions are creating the injustice that the people in Galilee are suffering under. And if we don't tell that message to them, then they're liable just to go along their merry way. And in fact, because the Romans are much stronger than the Jews of Palestine, in just a few short years between the writing of Mark's gospel and the writing of Luke's gospel, Rome says, we're just tired of this whole thing. Sort of like what's going on in Ukraine. We'll just obliterate Jerusalem because it's just so troublesome. It's a thorn in our side, Rome says, and we're just obliterate. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. All the structures and institutions that had existed for at least 1,000 years are totally obliterated. And the city is left desolate. So it almost seems at that point that this whole effort to address the injustices with the message of the reign of God seems to be pointless. Now, look in this story again, because when Jesus becomes resolute, they go into a Samaritan village, and if you remember how this worked, is that the Samaritans were, they were the people that got left behind by the great dispersion, by the great exile, when Babylon and Syria and whoever comes in and moves all the people over to Babylon, that the Samaritans were left because somebody had to stay behind to till the fields and to keep the food going to Babylon. So the Samaritans were Jews who only relied upon the written Torah. When the people, the Israelites, come back from exile as Jews, they now not only have the written Torah, but they've also got all the experiences of the past 50 to 60 years that have accumulated into what's called the oral tradition. So that they've expanded the Torah to not only be what is in the Torah, but also what's in the life of people. So the Samaritans were outside of the norm, outside the tradition of Israel, if you will, of Judaism. So there was an enmity that existed between Samaritans and Jews. And the enmity was because, as if you remember the story, that when Jesus sits down at the well and talks to a Samaritan woman, she says, our people worship here on Mount Gerizim. You people go down to Jerusalem. That's why we don't like you, because you go down and associate with all those hobnobbing, with all the politicians and bureaucrats down there in Jerusalem. And we believe we have the pure tradition here in Samaria. Hence, that when they go through the city, the disciples think everybody's going to welcome and embrace them. And they don't. Why? Because to the Samaritans, you are the interlopers. You are the outsiders to the Samaritans. When the Samaritans had been the outsiders to the Jews, now when you're in their land, you're an outsider. You know that, right? If you travel to any foreign country, right? You immediately know you're the outsider. When you're here, you believe you're the insider, right? And everybody else is the outsider. So look at their response. They want to call down hellfire and damnation upon the Samaritans for not accepting the word that Jesus has spoken and not accepting the vision that Jesus has taught. Their response to being rejected is to bring hellfire and damnation upon the people. Now notice, Jesus doesn't really respond to it. He just says, let's move on. Isn't that an interesting response? Let's move on. Let's keep going. Let them alone. Let them be who they are. In other words, not stand in condemnation and judgment upon the people who have rejected you, but rather simply let them be and then move on. But the resoluteness of Jesus is now seen in these individuals who want to follow Jesus, but really put their discipleship and their fellowship with Jesus second to all the other issues in their life. Let me bury my father. Wow. I mean, he says, isn't that a terrible response? If you're in the midst of grief and suffering and somebody says, let the dead bury the dead, wow, it seems insensitive, doesn't it? Jesus says, if you're going to do this, listen, if you're going to do this, if you're going to be my disciples, yes, there are going to be things that come up in your life that you have to attend to. But even in attending to those things, you can't lose sight and focus about your primary identity, which is a disciple of mine. So that in how you bury the dead, how you carry out your daily business, all has to be done, not from the perspective of those incidences and events, but rather have to be done in light of you being my disciple. So how you show compassion to others, how you treat others with dignity and respect are not for their benefit, but for you to understand that this is what's required of you as my disciple. So that the primary, if you're going to be disciples, then this is what you have to be and have to do and have to understand about your life in the world. That's very different in the sense that it sounds like an individual personal choice. And that's not it. When you become a disciple, you become a part of a community. And in being a part of a community, you take on the identity of that community in such a way that then when you live in the world, you are not stepping out of community to live in the world, but you're extending community to the world around you. Meaning it's like that, throw a rock in the pond and the ripples that go out. That's what's meant to be happening. That the pebble thrown in is Jesus, and the ripples are the subsequent generations after Jesus that take the experience of Jesus into the world with them, so that the transformation and change is not a personal transformation and change. It's first and foremost a transformation and change of the world. And then that enables us to live in the world as disciples of Jesus. The world has to be changed first, and then we will be able to live in the world as disciples. I say that, and I attached it on the e-Sojourner this week. I found this article, and it's like I want to ask Jesus a question. When he resolutely sets his face steadily towards Jerusalem, where are you going? Why are we going to Jerusalem when everything's fine here in Galilee? Why do we have to go to Jerusalem? We know what's going to happen there. So where are you up to, Jesus? Why are you wanting us to go to Jerusalem at this moment in time? And so the article, I want to suggest this to us, all right? That what's happening in Mark and Luke's community is a new way of approaching their life in the world, but also their life in community, but also their faith and belief and how they're going to form community. Perhaps the buzzword in the article that I shared a little bit with you is that it's really moving to create a new paradigm, a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding, a new way of responding, a new way of being in the world. And the new paradigm means, the reason why it's a new paradigm is the suggestion that the old is just no longer able to work. It's not working. It's not working. How we've done things always is just not working. That the structures and institutions of the world are not working. We see that. We know that. We experience it. In the same way, the structures and institution of church is not working. It's not functioning. In fact, it's dysfunctional in many ways. And so the writer of this article says that a new ideal of what it means to be a part of the fellowship of Jesus is forming. So what is that going to entail? And just a couple of things. It means that if church is to make a difference, think us, if we are to make a difference in the new emerging world, it must move us from being a pseudo-community, is the word he uses, to becoming a real community. As I read this, and I'll post the full article, it's one thing to say that we're open and affirming, we're welcoming, we're embracing, we believe in justice, we're committed to justice. But if that's only words, and it's not real, it has to be more than that. It has to go beyond that. To a real community where it's not only practiced in the community by us towards one another, but it's also what we find in association with other communities who are also trying to do this. So maybe that's a part of it. I can just say this, all right? It's like when a few of us went to look at the possibility of a new space, right? We walked into the big room, much like this, and I think we all just kind of went, not much looking like church here. But when we walked into the sanctuary, we went, oh, wow, this looks like church. Now think about it for a moment. Would what we do here work better in what the old looking like sanctuary was? Or would it work better in the group that we created this space? He says later in this article, you know, maybe what we do here is not the most important thing. Maybe worship. And how much of us, in terms of our contact with church, happens only in worship? Maybe he says we need to do mission first. It's always been a thought, and I'll stop with this and you can read more in the article. It's always been thought that the church gathers around the table to worship, giving us the energy, the motivation, and the sustenance and nourishment to do what we do in the world. So that it starts here and goes there. When this mission focus has to do with, we're engaged in the world first. And then we bring that, the pain, the suffering, the grieving, the anger, the despair of the world. We bring that here and let what we do here be the source of our healing so that we can continue doing what we do in the world. So that this isn't the primary source of our nourishment, but rather it's the place where we nourish each other for the ongoing work and mission in the world. We have to ask ourselves what this new paradigm is about. And more presentation as Jesus goes towards Jerusalem and see for the rest of the summer what that might look like and how that might be shaped. In whatever way it is that we are attentive to the resoluteness of Jesus and the statement that Jesus makes. We cannot look back. And to me, that means we cannot look to the past for our answers. We have to look to the future. But when we don't know what the future is, how do we go towards the future? But you see, what we're doing now shapes the future that we want to be and how we want to be, not only as individuals, but as church.